The Western Philosophy, Will Durant. Chapter 7, Section 7, The Wisdom of Death. And yet, something more is needed. By nirvana, the individual achieves the peace of willlessness and finds salvation, but after the individual life laughs at the death of the individual, it will survive him in his offspring or in the offspring of others, even if his little stream of life runs dry. There are 1,000 other streams that grow broader and deeper with every generation. How can man be saved? Is there a nirvana for the race as well as for the individual? Obviously, the only final and radical conquest of the will must lie in stopping up the source of life, the will to reproduce. The satisfaction of the reproductive impulse is utterly and intrinsically reprehensible because it is the strongest affirmation of the lust for life. What crime have these children committed that they should be born? If now we contemplate the turmoil of life, we behold all occupied with its want and misery, straining all their powers to satisfy its infinite needs and to ward off its multifarious sorrows, yet without daring to hope for anything else than simply the preservation of this tormented existence for a short span of time. In between, however, and in the midst of this tumult, we see the glance of two lovers meet longingly, yet why so secretly, fearfully, and stealthily? Because these lovers are the traitors who seek to perpetuate the whole want and drudgery which would otherwise speedily reach an end. Here lies the profound reason for the shame connected with the process of generation. It is woman that is the culprit here, for which knowledge has reached to willlessness. Her thoughtlessness charms allure man again into reproduction. Youth has not intelligence enough to see how brief these charms must be, and when the intelligence comes, it is too late. With young girls, nature seems to have had in view that, in the language of the drama, is called a striking effect, as for a few years she dowers from them with a wealth of beauty and is lavish in her gift of charm at the expense of all the rest of their lives, so that during those years they may capture the fancy of some man to such a degree that he is hurried away into undertaking the honorable care of them, as long as they live a step for which there would not seem to be any sufficient warrant of if only reason directed man's thoughts. Here, as elsewhere, nature proceeds with her usual economy. For just as the female ant, after fecundation, loses her wings, which are then superfluous, nay, actually a danger to the business of breeding, so after giving birth to one or two children, a woman generally loses her beauty, probably indeed for similar reason. Young men ought to reflect that if the object which inspires them today to write madrigals and sonnets had been born 18 years earlier, it would scarcely have won a glance from them. After all, men are much more beautiful in body than women. It is only a man whose intellect is clouded by his sexual impulse that could give the name of the fair sex to that undersized, narrow shouldered, broad hipped, and short legged race, for the whole beauty of the sex is bound up with this impulse. Instead of calling them beautiful, there would be more warrant for describing women as the unaesthetic sex. Neither for music, nor for poetry, nor for the fine arts have they really and truly any sense of susceptibility. It is a mere mockery if they make a pretense of it in order to assist their endeavor to please. They are incapable of taking a purely objective interest in anything. The most distinguished intellects among the whole sex have never managed to produce a single achievement in the fine arts that is really genuine and original, or given to the world any work of permanent value in any sphere. This veneration of women is a product of Christianity and of German sentimentality, and it is in turn a cause of that romantic movement which exalts feeling, instinct, and will above the intellect. The Asiatic know better and frankly recognize the inferiority of women. When the laws gave women equal rights with men, they ought to have endowed them with masculine intellects. Asia again shows a fine honesty than ours in its marriage institution. It accepts as normal and legal the custom of polygamy when though so widely practiced among us is covered with the fig leaf of a phrase. Where are three there any real monogamists, and how absurd it is to give property rights to women. All women are, with rare exceptions, inclined to extravagance because they live only in the present, and their chief outdoor sport is shopping. Women think that it is man's business to earn money and theirs to spend it. This is their conception of the division of labor. I am therefore of opinion that women should never be allowed altogether to manage their own concerns, but should always stand under actual male supervision, be it of father, of husband, of son, or of the state, as is the case in Hindustan, and the consequently they should never be given full power to dispose of any property they have not themselves acquired. It was probably the luxury and extravagance of the women of Louis XIV's court that brought on the general corruption of government which culminated in the French Revolution. The less we have to do with women, then the better. They are not even a necessary evil. Life is safer and smoother without them. Let man recognize the snare that lies in women's beauty and the absurd comedy of reproduction with end. Will end. The development of intelligence will weaken or frustrate the will to reproduce and will thereby at last achieve the extinction of the race. Nothing could form a finer denouncement to the insane tragedy of the restless world. Why should the curtain that has just fallen upon defeat and the death always rise again upon a new life, a new struggle, and a new defeat? How long shall we be lured into this much ADC about nothing? This endless pain that leads only to a painful end. When shall we have the courage to fling defiance into the face of the world, to tell it that the loveliness of life is a lie, and that the greatest boon of all is death? Section 8, Criticism. The natural response to such a philosophy is a medical diagnosis of the age and of the man. Let us realize again that we have here a phenomenon akin to that which, in the days after Alexander and after Caesar, brought first to Greece and then to Rome a flood of Oriental faiths and attitudes. It is characteristic of the East to see the external world in nature as so much more powerful than the will in man, and to come readily to a doctrine of resignation and despair. As the decay of Greece brought the pallor of Stoicism and the hectic flush of Epicureanism upon the cheeks of Hylas, so the chaos of the Napoleonic was brought into the soul of Europe, that plaintive weariness which made Schopenhauer its philosophic voice. Europe had a terrible headache. In 1815, the personal diagnosis can take its lead from Schopenhauer's admission that a man's happiness depends on what he is, rather than on external circumstance. Pessimism is an indictment of the pessimist, given diseased constitution and a neurotic mind, a life of empty leisure and gloomy ennui, and there emerges the proper physiology for Schopenhauer's philosophy. One must have leisure to be a pessimist. An active life almost always brings good spirits in body and in mind. Schopenhauer admires the serenity that comes of modesty, aims, and steady life, but he could hardly speak of these from personal experience. Deputies in Antioch, Greece. Truly, he had money enough for continuous leisure, and he found continuous leisure to be more intolerable than continuous work. Perhaps the tendency of philosophers toward melancholy is due to the unnaturalness of sedentary occupations. Too often, an attack upon life is merely a symptom of the lost art of excretion. Nirvana is the ideal of a listless man, a child harrowed or arraigned who has begun by desiring too much, by staking all on one passion, and then, having lost, spends the remainder of his life in a passionless and petulant boredom. If intellect arises as the servant of will, it is quite likely that the particular product of the intellect, which we know as the philosophy of Schopenhauer, was the cover and apology of a diseased and indolent will. And no doubt his early experiences with women and with men developed an abnormal suspiciousness and sensitivity, as it did in Stendhal and Flaubert and Nietzsche. He became cynical and solitary. He writes, "A friend in need is not a friend indeed. He is merely a borrower. And do not tell a friend anything that you would conceal from an enemy." He advises a quiet, monotonous hermit life. He fears society and has no sense of the values or joys of human association. But happiness thus dies when it is not shared. There is, of course, a large element of egotism in pessimism. The world is not good enough for us, and we turn up our philosophic noses to it. But this is to forget Spinoza's lesson that our terms of moral censure and approbation are merely human judgments, mostly irrelevant when applied to the cosmos as a whole. Perhaps our supercilious disgust with existence is a cover for a secret disgust with ourselves. We have botched and bungled our lives, and we cast the blame upon the environment or the world, which have no tongues to utter a defense. The mature man accepts the natural limitations of life. He does not accept Providence to be prejudiced in his favor. He does not ask for loaded dice with which to play the game of life. He knows with Carlyle that there is no sense in vilifying the sun because it will not light our cigars. And perhaps if we are clever enough to help it, the sun will do even that. And this vast neutral cosmos may turn out to be a pleasant place enough if we bring a little sunshine of our own to help it out. In truth, the world is neither with us nor against us. It is but raw material in our hands and can be heaven or hell according to what we are. Part of the cause of pessimism in Schopenhauer and his contemporaries lay in their romantic attitudes and expectations. Youth expects too much of the world. Pessimism is the morning after optimism, just as 1815 had to pay for 1789. The romantic exaltation and the liberation of feeling, instinct and will, and the romantic contempt for intellect, restraint, and order brought their natural penalties for the world. As Horace Walpole said, is a comedy for those who think, but a tragedy for those who feel. Perhaps no movement has been so prolific of melancholy as emotional romanticism. When the romanticist discovers that his ideal of happiness works out into actual unhappiness, he does not blame his ideal. He simply assumes that the world is unworthy of being exquisitely organized as himself. How could a capricious universe ever satisfy a capricious soul? The spectacle of Napoleon rise to empire, Rousseau's denunciation, and Kant's critic of the intellect, and his own passionate temperament and experiences conspired to suggest to Schopenhauer the primacy and the ultimacy of the will. Perhaps, too, Waterloo and St. Helena helped to develop a pessimism born, no doubt, of bitter personal contact with the stings and the penalties of life. Here was the most dynamic individual will in all history, imperiously commanding continents, and yet its doom was as certain and ignominious as that of the insect to which the day of its birth brings inevitable death. It never occurred to Schopenhauer that it was better to have fought and lost than never to have fought at all. He did not feel like the more masculine and vigorous Hegel, the glory and desirability of strife. He longed for peace and lived in the midst of war. Everywhere he saw strife. He could not see behind the strife the friendly aid of neighbors, the rollicking joy of children and young men, the dances of vivacious girls, the willing sacrifice of parents and lovers, the patient bounty of the soil, and the renaissance of spring. And what is desire fulfilled leads only to another desire. Perhaps it is better that we should never be content. Happiness, says an old lesson, lies rather in achievement than in possession or uh, satiation. Satiation. Uh, satiation. The healthy man asks not so much for happiness as for an opportunity to exercise his capacities. And if he must pay the penalty of pain for this freedom and this power, he makes the forfeit cheerfully. It is not too great a price. We need resistance to raise us, as it raises the airplane or the bird. We need obstacles against which to sharpen our strength and stimulate our growth. Life without tragedy would be unworthy of a man. Is it true that he that increased knowledge increased sorrow, and that it is the most highly organized beings that suffer most? Yes, but it is also true that the growth of knowledge increases joy as well as sorrow, and that the subtlest delights as well as the keenest pains are reserved for the developed soul. Voltaire rightly preferred the Brahmin's unhappy wisdom to the blissful ignorance of the peasant woman. We wish to experience life keenly and deeply, even at the cost of pain. We wish to venture into its innermost secrets, even at the cost of disillusionment. Virgil, who had tasted every pleasure and knew the luxuries of imperial favor, at last, tired of everything except the joys of understanding. When the senses cease to satisfy, it is something to have one access, however arduously, to comradeship with those artists, poets, and philosophers whom only the mature mind can comprehend. Wisdom is a bittersweet delight, deepened by the very discords that enter into its harmony. Is pleasure negative? Only a sorely wounded soul, drawing itself in from contact with the world, could have uttered so fundamental a blasphemy against life. What is pleasure but the harmonious operation of our instincts? And how can pleasure be negative except where the instinct at work makes for retreat rather than for approach? The pleasures of escape and rest, of submission and security, of solitude and quiet, are no doubt negative, because the instincts that impel us to them are essentially negative forms of flight and fear. But shall we say the same of the pleasures that come when positive instincts are in command, instincts of acquisition and possession, of pugnacity and mastery, of action and play, of association and love? Is the joy of laughter negative, or the romping of the child, or the song of the mating bird, or the crow of Chanticleer, or the creative ecstasy of art? Life itself is a positive force, and every normal function of it holds some delights. It remains true, no doubt, that death is terrible. Much of its terror disappears if one has lived a normal life. One must have lived well in order to die well. And would deathlessness delight us? Who envies the fate of Ahasuerus, to whom immortal life was sent as the Heavy is the punishment that could he inflicted upon man. And why is death terrible if not because life is sweet? We need not say with Napoleon that all who fear death are atheists at heart, but we may surely say that a man who lives to 60 years and 10 has survived his pessimism. No man, said Goethe, is a pessimist after 30, and hardly before 20. Pessimism is a luxury of self conscious and self important youth that comes out of the warm bosom of the communistic family into the cold atmosphere of individualistic competition and greed, and then yearns back to its mother's breast, youth that hurls itself madly against the windmills and the evils of the world, and sadly sheds utopia and ideals with every year. But before 20 is the joy of the body, and after 30 is the joy of the mind. Before 20 is the pleasure of protection and security, and after 30 the joy of parentage and home. How should a man avoid pessimism who has lived almost all his life in a boarding house and who abandoned his only child illegitimate anonymity? At the bottom of Schopenhauer's unhappiness was his rejection of the normal life, his rejection of women and marriage and children. He finds in parentage the greatest of evils, where a healthy man finds in it the greatest of life's satisfactions. He thinks that the stealthiness of love is due to shame in continuing the race. Could anything be more pedantically absurd? He sees in love only the sacrifice of the individual to the race, and ignores the delights with which the instinct repays the sacrifice, delights so great that they have inspired the most of the poetry of the world. He knows woman only as shrew and as sinner, and he imagines that there are no other types. He thinks that the man who undertakes to support a wife is a fool, but apparently such men are not much more unhappy than our passionate apostle of single felicity, and us Balzac said, "It costs as much to support a vice as it does to support a family." He scorns the beauty of woman as if there were any forms of beauty that we could spare and that we should not cherish as the color and the fragrance of life. What hatred of women one mishap had generated in this unfortunate soul. There are other difficulties, more technical and less vital, in this remarkable and stimulating philosophy. How can suicide ever occur in a world where the only real force is the will to live? How can the intellect, begotten and brought up as servant of the will, ever achieve independence and objectivity? Does genius lie in knowledge divorced from will, or does it contain as its driving force an immense power of will, even a large alloy of personal ambition and conceit? Is madness connected with genius in general, or rather with only the romantic type of genius? Byron, Shelley, Poe, Heineck, Swinburne, Strindberg, Dostoevsky, etc., and is not the classic and profounder type of genius exceptionally sound. Socrates, Plato, Spinoza, Bacon, Newton, Voltaire, Goethe, Darwin, Whiteman, etc. What if the proper function of intellect and philosophy is not the denial of the will, but the coordination of desires into a united and harmonious will? What if will itself accept us the unified product of such coordination is a mythical abstraction as shadowy as force? Nevertheless, there is about this philosophy a blunt honesty by the side of which most optimistic creeds appear as soporific, hypo, hypocrisies. It is all very well to say, with Spinoza, that good and bad are subjective terms, human prejudices, and yet we are compelled to judge this world not from any impartial view, but from the standpoint of actual human sufferings and needs. It was well that Schopenhauer should force philosophy to face the raw reality of evil and should point the nose of thought to the human tasks of elevation, it has been harder since his day for philosophy to live in the unreal atmosphere of logic sharpened metaphysics. Thinkers begin to realize that thought without action is a disease. After all, Schopenhauer opened the eyes of psychologists to the subtle depth and omnipresent force of instinct. Intellectualism, the conception of man as above all a thinking animal, consciously adapting means to rationally chosen end, fell sick with Rousseau, took to its bed with Kant, and died with Schopenhauer. After 2 centuries of introspective analysis, philosophy found behind thought, desire, and behind the intellect, instinct. Just as after a century of materialism, physics finds behind matter energy. We owe it to Schopenhauer that he revealed our secret hearts to us, showed us that our desires are the axioms of our philosophies, and cleared the way to an understanding of thought as no mere abstract calculation of impersonal events, but as a flexible instrument of action and desire. Finally, and despite exaggerations, Schopenhauer taught us again the necessity of genius and the value of art. He saw that the ultimate good is beauty, and that the ultimate joy lies in the creation or cherishing of the beautiful. He joined with Goethe and Carlyle in protest against the attempt of Hegel and Marx and Buckle to eliminate genius as a fundamental factor in human history. In an age when all the great seemed dead, he preached once more and ennobling worship of heroes. And with all his faults, he succeeded in adding another name to theirs. Today's lesson is over.